There is a specific kind of tired that has nothing to do with how much you've worked. You know the kind. It isn't in your body. It isn't from the hours. It's the tired that comes from wanting something for a very long time and getting it and discovering the wanting didn't stop. That tired doesn't have a name most people know. But you felt it every time the portfolio hit a new high and the arrival wasn't what the waiting said it would be. In every time the milestone landed and something in you was already somewhere else before the moment could settle. Every time you got exactly what you said you were building toward, the net worth, the paid-off house, the exit, and stood in it for about 3 seconds before the next version of it appeared on the horizon and the building started again without you deciding anything. Most people who feel this assume something is wrong with them. There isn't. There is something wrong with the variable they were given to chase. And the difference between the people who spend 20 years moving a finish line that never stops moving and the ones who actually arrive somewhere and feel it when they get there has nothing to do with how much they saved. It has to do with whether anyone ever showed them what they were actually building toward. Nobody showed you. That changes today. Here is what the accumulation phase does to the way you think. It gives you one variable to optimize. Save more. Grow more. Watch the number. Hit the milestone. Cross the threshold. The entire architecture of building wealth is organized around a single measurement, the number, and the implicit promise threaded through all of it is that once the number is large enough, the rest resolves. The feeling comes, the certainty comes, the retirement comes, the life you deferred everything for finally becomes available. And for a while, the promise holds. Because in the early stages of building, the number is genuinely the right thing to watch. It tells you if you're making progress. It tells you if the discipline is working. It tells you if the sacrifices are accumulating into something real. But somewhere in the middle of the journey, usually around the point where the number starts feeling significant, where the milestones start arriving with real weight, something shifts that the accumulation phase doesn't prepare you for. The number starts answering the wrong question. You're no longer asking whether you're making progress. You're asking whether you're done, whether it's enough, whether the thing you've been building toward is finally reachable. And the number can't answer that question. Not because the number is wrong, but because done isn't a number. Done is a condition, a structure, a specific configuration of assets and income and expenses and flexibility that produces something a number alone never will. The certainty you're waiting for. And the reason the target keeps moving, the reason every threshold you cross produces 3 seconds of arrival before the next one appears, is that you've been solving for the number while the condition was going unbuilt. More of the wrong variable doesn't produce the right answer. It just moves the line further out. What you're actually building toward isn't one thing, it's 3. And almost everyone in the accumulation phase is somewhere between the first 2 while believing they're approaching the 3rd. That gap, between where you actually are and where you believe you are, is where most of the risk lives, and most of the exhaustion. The first condition is the one that changes how retirement feels. Not whether it's structurally safe, not whether the numbers hold across 30 years of real market behavior, just whether it feels possible. Number says whether leaving employment feels like a choice rather than an impossibility. There is a specific moment when this arrives. Different for everyone, but recognizable when it comes. You look at what you've built and for the first time ask a question you've never asked seriously before. Could I stop if I had to? Not should you, not would you. Just, could you? Before this point, the answer is clearly no. After it, the answer becomes maybe. And that maybe changes something that's difficult to describe, but impossible to miss once it happens. The optionality becomes real. For most people, this arrives somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000 depending on where they live and what their life costs. But the specific figure matters less than the specific experience. The first time the weight of that question shifted. You probably remember when it arrived. What almost no one realizes in that moment is what they're actually standing on. Now, this is a psychological threshold, not a structural one. It changes how retirement feels. It doesn't change whether retirement is actually safe. And the gap between those two things, between how retirement feels and whether it will actually hold across 30 or 40 years of real life, is exactly where everything goes wrong. The second condition is the one that breaks the most people, not because it's the hardest to build, because it's the easiest to mistake for the finish line. Thus, here is the specific way it happens. You cross the first threshold. The maybe becomes a serious consideration. You run the numbers. The math looks right. The 4% rule, withdraw 4% annually, and historically, the portfolio survives 30 years, says you're there or close. The spreadsheet checks out. Everything on paper says the thing you've been building toward is finally reachable. So you stop. Or you plan to stop. Or you start planning seriously enough that stopping feels imminent. And then something happens that the spreadsheet didn't account for. Not a catastrophe. Just sequence. The market in year 2 of your retirement does what markets do periodically. It drops. Meaningfully. And because you're withdrawing from the portfolio at the same time it's declining, selling shares at reduced prices every month to fund the life, something happens that can't be undone. The recovery comes. It always comes. But you own less of it than you would have if the timing had been different. The shares you sold at the bottom aren't there anymore to participate in what comes after. Same portfolio, same average return, different sequence. One version of this retires comfortably. The other version runs out of money. This is not a hypothetical risk. It is the specific mechanics of how retirements that looked right on paper quietly break in practice. And it hits hardest in the first 8 to 10 years, early enough to cause permanent structural damage before the long-run averages have time to help. At larger portfolio sizes, there's enough buffer that this risk is manageable. At the sizes most people are working with, it isn't. Which means the retirement decision isn't just about whether the number is large enough. It's about whether the structure surrounding the number is built to absorb what the number alone can't. Thus, that structure has two components that almost no one includes when they calculate their retirement number. The first is income optionality, not income you depend on. Income you have access to if conditions require it. Consulting work you could do a few hours a week. A skill that produces $800 a month without consuming your life. Rental income, Social Security timing flexibility. Passive income that runs alongside retirement rather than replacing it. Not because you'll definitely need it. Manos, because having access to it changes what the portfolio has to carry alone. A portfolio that has to fund every dollar of every month by itself is in a fundamentally different structural position than one that only has to cover part of the load. The withdrawal rate drops. The sensitivity to sequence drops. The margin for error expands. The second component is expense range. If your retirement requires $6,000 a month with almost no room to compress, if every dollar of that is load-bearing, your structural position is weaker than someone spending the same amount, but able to reduce to $4,000 if conditions require it without significant impact on the quality of the life. That range, the distance between what you spend and what you could spend if you had to, is a structural asset. It doesn't appear on a balance sheet. It doesn't show up in the net worth calculation. But in the first 5 years of retirement, when sequence risk is highest, it can be the difference between a difficult period and a permanent problem. A $1.2 million portfolio with no income optionality and a rigid spending floor can be structurally weaker than a $900,000 portfolio with 2 reliable income supplements and a life that has genuine range in it. This is why the second condition isn't a number. It's a design. And most people spend years accumulating toward a figure they believe represents this condition without ever actually building it. They arrive at the number. The design isn't there. And retirement risk peaks at exactly that moment, right when the number looks complete and the structure hasn't been built, because the gap between them is invisible until it isn't. There are three variables that belong in the picture that most retirement calculations leave out. The first is healthcare. If you retire before Medicare eligibility at 65, you carry the full cost of health coverage alone. For one person in reasonable health, that can mean $500 to $1,000 a month in premiums before a single claim is made. For two people, it can reach $2,000 or more, depending on age and health status. That is not a footnote. That is a first-row line item, the one the entire expense model gets built around. And for an early retirement that begins at 52, it represents a potential decade of costs before Medicare arrives. $150,000 to $200,000 that has to come from somewhere before the portfolio even begins the 30-year horizon most models assume. It needs to be in the calculation before the decision is made, not discovered after. The second variable is longevity. Most historical models supporting the 4% rule were built around a 30-year retirement horizon. If you retire at 52 and live to 91, you're planning for 39 years. The math doesn't collapse across every scenario, but it shifts, quietly, gradually, in ways that compound across decades, enough that the assumptions most people are using are built for a retirement shorter than the one they're actually likely to have. Planning for 30 years and living 40 is not a minor miscalculation. It's a structural failure that arrives slowly and announces itself too late. The third variable is tax drag. A 4% withdrawal from a traditional IRA isn't a 4% real withdrawal after tax. The gap depends on your bracket, your location, and how your accounts are structured. It doesn't catastrophically alter the picture in most scenarios, but it erodes the actual purchasing power of withdrawals more than the nominal rate suggests, quietly across decades, in a way that the spreadsheet running the projection almost never accounts for. None of these variables make retirement impossible at the numbers most people are building toward. They make the structure matter more than the number, which is exactly the point. The third condition is the one you're actually imagining when you picture the finish line. Full spending flexibility. Low sensitivity to what the market does in year 2 or year 3. No structural requirement for income supplements. Enough buffer that a difficult early sequence creates discomfort rather than damage. A year of tightening rather than a decade of compounding pressure. In practical terms, this tends to mean a portfolio sustaining your target lifestyle at a withdrawal rate around 3% to 3.5%. Conservative enough that even a significant market disruption in the early years doesn't force the decisions you never wanted to be in a position to make. It's worth being precise about what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean certainty. Nothing produces certainty across a 40-year horizon in a world where markets move and healthcare inflates and life costs what it costs in ways no model fully predicts. What it means is that the sensitivity to variance is low enough that ordinary bad years, the ones that come for every retirement eventually, don't force permanent changes to the life. The distance between the second condition and the third isn't just size. It's the distance between a retirement that works when things go roughly as planned and a retirement that works when they don't. Most people are imagining the third condition when they picture themselves done. Most people are building toward the second one without knowing it. And a small number of people, the ones who understood what they were actually building toward before they finished building it, designed the structure first and watched the number reflect it. Und hat. Those are the people who crossed the finish line and felt it when they arrived. Here is the thing about the order of these three conditions that matters more than the conditions themselves. People skip the second one, not intentionally. They don't decide to skip it. They just never learned it existed as a separate thing to build. So they accumulate toward all what they believe is the third, the number that looks like full freedom, and arrive at a structure that was never actually designed for it. And then year 3 arrives. The market does what markets do. The healthcare costs appear in the expense model the way they always were going to. The withdrawal rate that felt conservative starts feeling like something else when the account is smaller than it was at the start, and the sequence is working against you, and the income optionality was never built. So the portfolio has to carry everything alone. And the retirement that looked complete from the outside starts requiring decisions it was never supposed to require. This is not a rare story. It's the ordinary result of spending the accumulation phase optimizing for the variable you were given, the number, while the condition the number was always supposed to represent went unbuilt. The fix isn't more, it's different. It's understanding which of these 3 conditions your current position actually reflects, not which one the number suggests, which one the structure supports, because those are often 2 different answers. And the gap between them is the whole thing. You have probably already crossed the first condition. The maybe is real. The optionality exists in some form, even if you haven't fully named it. The question of whether you could stop if you had to has a different weight than it did 5 years ago. The question worth sitting with now is which side of the second one you're actually on. Not whether the number is large enough, whether the structure is actually built. Income optionality that doesn't depend on full employment. An expense range with genuine flexibility rather than a floor you can't go below. Healthcare in the first row of the model, not the asterisk at the bottom. A withdrawal rate kept conservative enough that the early years have room to be difficult without becoming catastrophic. Those aren't features you add after the number is right, but they're the conditions that make the number mean what you think it means. The target has been moving because you've been chasing the number. The target stops moving when you build what the number was always supposed to sit inside. And here is the thing about that. The thing that tends to land differently than everything else once you hear it. For most people reading this, the structure isn't a decade away. It isn't another $500,000 away. It's a design problem, not a size problem. Zombies and design problems have a different kind of solution than savings problems do. You don't solve them by waiting. You solve them by looking at the right variable for the first time, which is what you're doing right now.